Who are these people?
Crab on today for our next story, since he so actually wrote it himself, which I love someone doing work. That's always nice.
That's always great.
It's always great when someone else. It's like when someone else makes your sandwich. It's like guaranteed 60% better tasting if someone else makes it than if you made it.
And I don't even really do this either. I mean, I mostly make art for INN.
Right.
I make music and
those of you who are behind, those of you who know us now, you the thumbnails that you see on Jesse Jett's American Tradition. Greg does those. The thumbnails
how did we miss that?
Greg does those, as well as so Greg is works behind the scenes, but this is your first Substack article, right?
Yeah.
No, I don't I was gonna say I don't really write things, but because this is kind of directly affected my country. I'm from not from second generation Croatian. My parents are from there. They're actually there right now, and they can already see the impacts of how low energy supply and just the general Ukraine war and everything going on over there is not only affecting a recession in the United States, but it's actually even worse in Europe. And that's why you kind of see a lot of these protests rising up, Belgium, France, etc. And this was just kind of talking about how the euro exchange rates, single currency economics is kind of a way to put the cost of inflation on working class people instead of governments who can easily take on the debt if they wanted to. But
recent developments on Tuesday, which was last Tuesday, pretty much.
That was 2 Tuesdays ago, man.
Gotcha.
That was 2 weeks ago.
EU finance ministers gave Croatia the final green light to adopt the euro single currency on January the 1st. Bulgaria is the next country in line to join the euro and has stated its willingness to adopt it as of January the 1st, 24. EU Commission Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis insists that joining the euro will bring tangible economic benefits for Croatia. He further adds that using the euro will make it easier and more attractive to invest in your country. It will lower barriers for businesses and remove currency exchange costs. However, many Croatians, such as myself, are apprehensive about the euro's arrival. Many anticipate that prices will go up, especially since businesses will have to round up prices when converting from the Croatian kuna. Right?
Prices are already bad.
With the war in Ukraine, several countries are now making the move to take part in the globalized neoliberal project, such as Finland and Sweden joining NATO, as well as more and more European nations taking part in the Eurozone's central banking system. In the onset of several European crises throughout the 20th and 21st century, the political response by EU powers has only been the radicalization of neoliberal integration. Instead of tackling the fundamental problem of distribution between labor and capital by creating any sort of sustainable structure for the EU economy, the prevailing view on European integration, namely that more market freedom is always better, has always been considered prosperity enhancing and would lead to an increase in efficiency. Despite these reforms, though, the enforcement of an EU single market has not led to economic growth since the 1970s and instead has weakened growth on a worldwide scale. As a second-generation Croatian, which you are, Greg, I would like to examine and demonstrate the introduction of a single currency as a key factor in the advancement of neoliberalism and colonialism throughout the European continent. Through instruments of capitalism such as debt, neoliberalism has evolved into a political agenda that replaces democratic control over economic policy with a system of economic management ruled by elites. The Eurocentric narratives of development throughout history can seen only to endorse technocratic despotism, financial deregulation, the destruction of democracy, and the debasement of wage earners into a new proletariat regime within the modern world. Yet, discussions of the course of the euro's integration cannot be approached merely as a timeline of events. Instead, it is important to understand why certain events occurred, who the driving forces were, and what impact they had. So,
and one thing I wish I did mention in this article, but I didn't really dive into too much, was the theory of MMT. And I know, I spoke to Colin, I DM'd Colin a little bit about this, about Stephanie Kelton's book, the name is losing me. But MMT theory about the idea that money is not like a normal household. It's much more like if you were to play like World of Warcraft or RuneScape, like where you could literally just go in the back end and just type in a bunch of zeros.
Yeah,
you can make that money. Money is not like, especially like when you talk about fiat currency, like the definition of fiat is literally that it's not based off of anything.
right.
So these and you'll get to it here, but like you can see like a pattern throughout the 20th and 21st centuries where we could have easily avoided these financial crises. Like it's similar to what happened in 2008 here, by having the government take on more debt. But we have this idea of debt bad, surplus good, which is just simply not the case. Not in our current economy.
Makes sense. So the introduction of European integration. In fact, the initial attempts at European integration were met with great success. The 1950s and 1960s were characterized by an economic boom, and peace prevailed among the European states. These experiences led to a certain degree of willingness on capital to compromise with employees, thereby avoiding the escalation of conflicts and the associated negative consequences. So, yes, when capitalism works, it has to work for the people. Pretty much, is what you're saying. Next slide. There we go. In the 1930s, a new development model emerged in the United States as part of the New Deal aimed at increasing wages and providing social welfare. This showed that such an approach was compatible with dynamic capitalistic development and high profit growth. As a result, the quality of life was able to improve rapidly for many people. The focus on industrial development during the 1930s can best be understood in light of the global economic recession of that time and the rise of extremist political movements such as the far right in Europe. The consequences of this internal struggle were tragically realized when Adolf Hitler's election to power in Germany and the outbreak of World War II. So, by the 1970s, there was a dramatic decrease in the scale of economic growth. The policy of high interest rates was introduced by the US in 1979, creating a major crisis in Europe relatively soon afterward. In view of the fixed exchange rate system and liberalized capital markets, monetary policy could not stabilize the economy as a whole, but merely stabilize the exchange rate. Unemployment rose rapidly, but instead of persisting with capital controls on capital movement, European leaders took the opposite route, right? So, yeah, I mean, pretty much capitalism as it was running caused those things.
This is all starting with Reagan. I mean,
right.
We can kind of see the beginnings here, and like really like a lot of this article is kind of just diving into the history of where this came from. But you can kind of see the European market is merely a United States creation. It's basically a secondary economy dependent entirely on us.
That makes sense. So, and it's pretty much, we took advantage of the crisis, right? And, that like the Marshall Plan, stuff like that, helping integrate a lot of that. So, as a key victorious power of the Second World War, the United States was anxious to establish functional capitalist structures in Western Europe. Concrete measures included the Marshall Plan and the establishment of a stable international financial order. The Bretton Woods system within it, post-war Europe, was crafted to remove trade barriers between European neighbors, as well as foster commerce between those countries and America. In addition to helping to reconstruct Europe, one of the stated goals of the Marshall Plan was to halt the spread of communism on the continent. The plan is also considered a key factor in the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's also worth noting that the Central Intelligence Agency received 5% of the funds allocated under the Marshall Plan. These funds were then used to establish front businesses in several European countries, some of which were designed to further American interests, and others that may have had even more nefarious purposes. The CIA had financed an anti-communist insurgency in Ukraine, which was a Soviet satellite state at the time. Interesting enough how that parallels some stuff now.
You could see right after World War II, Europe was in the midst of destruction, and you can kind of see where this is headed. The Marshall Plan, quote unquote, was supposed to help Europe rebuild its economy, but instead it was really just a matter of us trying to stop communism as much as possible.
Right.
Because the idea was to have like a more communal based economy, but the United States can't have that because we're king capitalists over here.
So, as Chomsky once described, the extension of the Marshall Plan aid in countries like France and Italy was strictly contingent on exclusion of communists, including major elements of the anti-fascist resistance and labor. From the government, democracy, in the usual sense, U.S. aid was critically important in early years for suffering people in Europe and was therefore a powerful lever of control. A matter of much significance for U.S. business interests and longer-term planning, the fear in Washington was that the communist left would emerge victorious in Italy and France without massive financial assistance. So, in Activism's Munich series, Re-examining History, an interview with Noam Chomsky further reveals the United States' effort to establish an economic world order and restore radical conservative policy to create a massive U.S.-dependent economy and destroy any and all social reform or anti-fascist resistance, offer in favor of Nazi and fascist collaborators. Most of the Marshall Plan money actually was transferred from one bank to another. In the United States, there was a big problem at that time, a major problem of industrial overproduction. The U.S. had a big service of industrial production, and the world just didn't have markets. The world was virtually devastated by the war, so part of the attempt to create markets for U.S. excess production, ensuring that the former colonial areas would provide dollars to Europe so they could purchase U.S. industrial production, called triangular trade programs. Another was the Marshall Plan, which did provide funding to purchase American exports. In the course of it, Europe did develop. Incidentally, I think about probably $2 billion of the $13 billion went for oil imports. That was part of the U.S. effort to turn Europe into an oil-dependent economy. The United States controlled the oil. Europe had coal, not oil. Same in Japan. They tried to turn them into oil-dependent economies. The reason that was expressed clearly by George Kennan was that if we did that, we would have what we called veto power over their policies, because we would essentially control the energy spigots. So,
and you can kind of see this crisis like taking place right now with the
with the gas and stuff, and right.
Yeah, it's important to note that Europe is not. You would think it has its own separate economy, its own separate idealized nation, but no, that's not the case. Europe's entire economy is entirely dependent on exports to the U.S. So that means that without the United States, Europe's economy would essentially fall. And like that's why you can see a lot of parallels between our economy and theirs, is because ever since World War II, they are entirely dependent on us.
Gotcha. So the 1990s saw the introduction of further integration measures in accordance with the neoliberal approach. The abandonment of fixed exchange rates in 1992 paved the way for the introduction of the euro. The collapse of the European monetary system and the idea that a single currency would help to curb Germany's influence also led many unions to advocate for its adoption. However, many expected that a neoliberal institutional structure would be put in place to administrate it. As it turned out, this is exactly what happened. Deregulation continued apace in Europe, increased Continued apace. Gotcha.
Yeah.
The consequences has been the suppression of wages and redistribution of wealth from wage earners to capitalists. In Germany, wages declined in real terms for a long period, mainly to Agenda 2010 and the Hartz reforms. Although declining wages usually result in demand problems and stagnation, it was possible in this case to prevent this. The neoliberal institutional structure of the euro turned out to be functional in this regard. It allowed Germany to maintain large export surpluses at the expense of the European periphery. So, you continue. The economic crisis in Europe can be attributed to the fact that the capital flowed out of countries that were dependent on exports. This was due to speculation against government bonds, which then turned into capital outflows. These affected Euro area member states most severely because the neoliberal European Central Bank wasn't intended to act as a lender of last resort for them. Instead, bailouts and other similar measures were drafted at the European level to prevent the complete collapse of the monetary union. However, these did not benefit the countries in the periphery, but mainly function in the interests of banks and other creditors in the core member states, essentially socializing the financial sector. The costs were borne by countries such as Greece and Spain, who were forced to introduce austerity policies, which have led to dramatic cuts in wages and benefits for their citizens. At the same time, labor markets have been liberalized to favor employers over employees and have reduced competition for jobs. So
they had like a super 2008. Like Obama,
right.
You know how he responded to the financial crisis. He
Yes.
bailed out all the banks. Europe did the same exact thing, except this affects, since they're all bonded by one single currency, this affects workers on an entire continent scale.
Gotcha.
You're having costs borne on countries like Greece, like I mentioned here, Greece and Spain, who are entirely dependent on the European central economy, and they're not bailing these countries out; they're giving it to the banks.
Yeah.
So the costs are essentially borne on wage earners and workers who have to basically sacrifice benefits and pay and jobs in order to essentially just socialize the banking system. Socialism for the rich.
Pretty much. As always. Yeah. So you have some takeaways a little bit. So the European monetary integration has taken away the ability of nations to devalue their currency in a time of economic turmoil. This has led to a conservative package of austerity measures being put into place, essentially what conservative economists have recommended since the 1930s. The policy response has been orthodox packages of austerity and downward pressure on wages. These measures have intensified social conflict in Europe and still haven't addressed the root causes of economic decline. The reluctance of the European Commission and ECB to utilize labor flexibility is indicative of their class bias. Moreover, this rigid approach has been integral to the EU's policy package in the face of macroeconomic volatility, right? The euro area, that still gets me, does not have many options when it comes to policy when faced with external shocks. Other than wage adjustments, there are little to no solutions left. It's not your fault, it's just words. You know, English language is terrible.
Euro area.
The euro area. Like, it's like, that's, I feel like Anchorman doing like the vocal exercises, you know?
Yeah.
So European integration has not been an entirely linear process. In fact, its history is rather complex, primarily because the Union has undergone a number of different forms and implementations throughout its existence, mainly in the favor of capital markets and conservative economic policy. As demonstrated, the neoliberal variant is not the only possible form of economic and political integration, but rather one of a number of possibilities. The stubborn implementation of this neoliberal form of integration was both the result of social class struggles throughout history and an answer to the burgeoning market crashes at that time. It occurred mainly at the expense of wage earners, while capitalists repeated the benefits. The European periphery was institutionalized at the EU level, with new and even more neoliberal rules derived from the initial ad hoc measures. These rules were thought to result in a brighter future for the people living there, but instead have resulted in a loss of democracy and are authoritarian in nature. As such, economic devastation was not solved in favor of capital. Capital profited from it. In particular, capitalists took advantage of the crisis to push through radicalized neoliberal forms of integration in Europe. This has already led to violent reactions from workers in the periphery, right? And you put this little video of...
I linked a tweet to the France protests that are happening. That happened fairly recently. That's why I kind of wish I mentioned MMT a little bit more, because it's showing that, like, how even within our current economy, we can have it's entirely possible with fiat currency to have the economy benefit us. But instead, we've used a number of excuses throughout the past 2 centuries in response to a crisis to instead push neoliberal reforms even more, like our response to 2008.
Right.
Essentially just having capitalists more and more powerful throughout time. And it's just getting worse and worse. Prices are getting bad.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, they're controlling all the resources too. So, like, anything you're trying to buy is inflated, right? Because because they want more money.
And inflation is not entirely in their control. That's more of like the supply of currency. But what they can do is have
stuff about inflation, that it's not necessarily. Go ahead.
It's more of like a contradiction of neoliberalism.
I feel you.
Later.
So the problems of the neoliberal economic policy and European integration have never been more apparent, yet more and more countries are joining the EU single market, further weakening the economic growth of these countries at the expense of wage earners and the working class. As a result, contradictions of neoliberalism, as well as the economic conditions of the EU, are only getting worse and worse as time goes on. And I think that's the end of your article, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. You see protests in France. They're actually burning shit down. They have a radically different response than what the U.S. has had the past couple decades.
Well, I think partially because Europe is in and of itself a much more populated, like more densely populated to me than like America is, just because of the size of the country we have, right? Like there's a lot of space in general.
No.
Whereas like
no, I would argue no. I think you might. I think maybe in terms of surface area, you might think so, but
yeah,
I would argue that like
it does have to do a lot with culture, though, too.
Yeah,
just the way that we treat politics and how it's kind of like politics is almost like entertainment here in the United States. Over there, they like take it pretty. I mean, even in countries outside of Europe and the West in general, you would see Sri Lanka. Their response to economic turmoil and lower quality of life is radically different than what the U.S. can ever even imagine at this point in time.
Johnny Axam, the point is that there is no fiscal constraint on how the EU can spend. It's all political, just like in the U.S. The euro makes it worse for each country. Yeah, because then they all have to like be on board, right?
And there's this whole Western idea. I mean, you could see that's why I mentioned the Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I think like this Ukraine war crisis kind of is just like pushing more and more countries towards the West.
Yeah,
and it's really just a death trap because there's supposed economic benefits supposed to be good for the economy, but really it just fucks you over in the long run. It makes you entirely dependent on the United States.
Right.